I want to introduce you to our work. We have recently started a national initiative and integrated resource on child protection, mental health, and psychosocial care under the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Government of India. Through this, we are going to work in the health, education, and welfare sector to all service providers and stakeholders, and which means the health sector, district mental health programs, child welfare committees, juvenile justice boards, childcare institutions, state and national judicial academies, legal services authorities, the National Police Academy at Hyderabad, the National Academy for Administration at Mussoorie, school education boards, any child, every child in all the spaces that children occupy and inhabit. The purpose of today's session, friends, came from a very specific request from Aish, which concerns legal issues for those cases that come under the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, particularly for children with speech and hearing problems. This specific request from Aish was about documentation in court processes, and we are given to understand that you do see instances of children who have, let's say, hearing and speech issues. Perhaps they have intellectual disability, perhaps they don't, but they come under the whole concern about POCSO and abuse. But before I start to share some of the issues of the do's and don'ts, and I will also guide you through clinical practice guidelines that my colleague Sheila Ramaswamy, who's also present here, and I have written in the Indian Journal of Psychiatry, which will give you a framework of how to proceed to actually do documentation and writing other than clinical response. I would like to hear from some of you as to some of the techniques that you actually use for data gathering or evidence gathering or history taking from children who have speech and hearing problem. And also specifically, what are the kind of concerns that you have about documentation in court processes? So if anyone would like to start, just to give me some idea of what your experiences have been, you can unmute yourself. And anyone, Dr. Gopi Shankar, Kusuma, Rajkumar, Madhusudan, Siddhi, Sriraj, Joel, Niranjana, Prashant, Tirumanjari, Vaishnav Babu, anyone, to just give me an idea of the kind of cases that I sees related to POCSO. Go ahead, Dr. Gopi Shankar. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me, sir?
Very clearly, sir. Go ahead.
Okay. Sir, actually, I'm Dr. Gopi Shankar, working as a research officer at Department of Clinical Services, All India Institute of Speech and Hearing.
Sir.
The question actually, sir, raised what kind of cases do you see here? Sir, we overall deal with broad cases of communication disorders. It includes...
Dr. Gopi Shankar, we are aware of that.
Yes, sir.
I'm more than familiar with what I sees. My question was not that. My question is, in the context of child abuse and POCSO, what is the kind of cases that you see? What is your approach and what are your concerns? Aish is very famous, Dr. Gopi Shankar. We are aware of the wonderful work that you do.
The issue is the RTA patients, that is in case of adult patients.
Right.
In case of child patients, most of the time they go for this residential school setup.
Right.
They put the child in the residential setup, and the parent and complaint will come on with that it's in a child abuse cases, sexual abuse by the teachers, and they'll become mute.
I see.
And they'll become a functional aphonic patients. But they'll become functional aphonia, they don't talk at all, and they'll refuse to, in case if a psychologist intervene, it will be very difficult to handle such patients because they don't, parents are not aware what's happening at the residential school. and the child will refuse to say what's happening around.
Right.
This is most commonly seen, sir, apart from our RTA patients. And hearing impaired adolescent girl, again rape cases we do get here. For
Okay, this is very interesting, Dr. Kobishankar. So what you're saying is neurotypical children in residential schools, when they are abused, these are not children with hearing and speech or communication disorders, but they develop functional aphonia, which is a dissociative symptom because of the trauma of abuse. And how do you work with that's one issue. The other is somewhat older children who may have communication problems or hearing and speech problems, who have unfortunately experienced sexual assault, and you have some method of, and so there are these two contexts that you've spoken about. I see that um, Sanjeev Gupta has also put on chat that see a lot of children with autism, intellectual disability, speech disorders, and cerebral palsy. And what happens when these children experience sexual abuse? How do you proceed to evaluate them? And then what's the kind of documentation you need to do? And what is the role of a professional from AYUSH when it comes to court processes? Sanjeev or anyone else, could you just take me through, when you see children with autism, intellectual disability, or speech disorder, or CP, who have experienced sexual abuse, what is your approach in actually eliciting history or eliciting experiences on the abuse itself for medical legal purposes? Sanjeev could respond to that, or anyone else. Rest, Lina, go ahead, Lina. You have unmuted yourself, Lina, which is why I've called your name. ನೀವು ಅನ್ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹೆಸರು ಕರೆದೆ. ನಿಮ್ದೇನಾದ್ರು ಪ್ರತಿಕ್ರಿಯೆ ಇದೆಯಾ? ಆಟಿಸಮ್ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಅಥವಾ ಮಾತು ಇಲ್ದೇ ಇರೋದು ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಲೈಂಗಿಕ ದೌರ್ಜನ್ಯ ಅನುಭವ ಅವರಿಗೆ ಆಗಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಅಪ್ರೋಚ್ ಯಾವ ತರ ಇದೆ? ಮೆಡಿಕಲ್ ಲೀಗಲ್ ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟೇಶನ್, ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ವಿಷಯ ಪ್ರಕ್ರಿಯೆಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಆಮೇಲೆ ಮಾತಾಡೋಣ. ಬಟ್ I was given to understand by our contact person that the processes of how you elicit history is all very clear to you, and you're looking only at medical legal approaches. But so I'm not able to interpret your silence on this issue. Anyway, Sanjeev says that.
So good morning.
Yeah.
This is Dr. Jayashree here.
Please go ahead, ma'am.
So this is not really something that I have come across with the children with autism, but yes, I have heard about it. So I'm just sharing that experience with you. Actually, there are a lot of cases with autism where we see that they can either be verbal or non-verbal. And most of the time, whenever we are eliciting certain things or certain emotions from them, we try getting them done through pictures.
Right.
And I think a lot of times we work with the psychologists also, especially when we are, kind of discussing, what is it that we want them to respond to. Right. So I've heard a couple, they don't so easily, but what happens is they tell us indirectly that this was somewhere the reason why we had to leave that private clinic and come back. So I think that is something very challenging for us, and which we get to know at a later course of time, by when the impact has already happened to children with autism.
Right.
People think that children with autism don't have emotions, but actually they do have, and they do understand what's happening in the environment. It's just that they're not able to express that. So I think somewhere we'll have to incorporate these things wherein, we can at least try make them understand through the other modes like pictures and so on. So this is just a small experience which we did with COVID-19, trying to make these children understand through pictures. Somewhere I feel that that's a very good clue for us to make these children understand, if something happens in your life, you can express it through these methods. So yes, it does happen. That's what I'm trying to say. And it could be happening anywhere. It's just that it's not coming out. So this was just my small experience with autism, sir.
Thank you very much for that share, Jayashree. Very, very useful. And I'll come to you, Sheila, in a bit. Just to say that Sanjeev is able to unmute his mic from his side, or that's what he's saying. But he's put in a post saying that while they see these children, let's say the autism spectrum that Jayashree alluded to, and they may not speak directly about sexual abuse, but while taking case history, indirectly they share these experiences. I don't know whether Sanjeev, when he says they, whether he means the children or whether he means the parents, they share the experience, presumably perhaps both, or perhaps the child and the parents don't know that. So one of the issues that Jayashree has raised is the issue of pictures and the manner of communicating with children who have communication disorders where MLC cases are concerned, and the admissibility of this as evidence, and what happens when you go to courts as expert witnesses. Sheila, would you like to come in at this moment?
Sorry. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sheila. I work with Dr. Shekhar Sheshadri. I am the technical lead on the national initiative project that Dr. Shekhar just introduced. I just had a question. Dr. Jayashree mentioned pictures. Can you tell us, either Dr. Jayashree or maybe other people who are working with children, what kind of pictures do you use with children to elicit, narratives of abuse? ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರ ಅಬ್ಯೂಸ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಅವ್ರ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪೀರಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅನುಭವ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ಬೇಕಾಗಿದ್ರೆ ಯಾವ ತರದ್ದು ಪಿಕ್ಚರ್ಸ್ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಾ, ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ, ನಿಮ್ದ ಅದು, ಅಂಡ್ ಹೇಗ್ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಾ ಪಿಕ್ಚರ್ಸ್? ಒಂದ್ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಪ್ರೋಸೆಸ್ ಡಿಸ್ಕ್ರಿಪ್ಷನ್ ಕೊಟ್ರೆ ನಮಗೂ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗತ್ತೆ, ನೀವ್ ಹೇಗ್ ಪ್ರೊಸೀಡ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಾ. Then it would give us clarity.
These autism children that we have seen, a lot of them, like I said, cannot express themselves. Okay, so they're more non-verbal children with autism. So when I say pictures, we actually make some pictures for them. See, there are certain children who actually follow that with line drawings. Okay, there are certain children wherein we might have to use real pictures. So what happens for daily communication, when we start off with these children, we don't always expect them to keep speaking, because it cannot happen like that. Because if they have a problem, then definitely they won't be able to speak. So we try using as much real pictures as possible with them, real photographs, I would say. So we do a lot of things called as picture exchange system. Okay. So it's more like, the parent or the clinician giving out a question, or a question in the form of picture itself. And then the child is also trying to point out through picture whatever they're trying to express. So that's what happens in our daily communication when we are trying to help these children communicate. So what my suggestion was, whenever, if we are trying to come out or teach these children about such issues, or any such issues. See, for example, I was just mentioning about COVID-19. And when we actually came up with something called as an e-flip book, which is more like a story in the picture form. And it moves like a story. And this is actually called as a social story, wherein we use a lot of pictures. So I think even, when we are trying to elicit such things from these children, these social stories with pictures are going to help a lot, because that's more closer to the reality, and it will tell you that what happened before, what happened during the act, and what happened after the act. So that's what we usually plan for daily communication.
So you have these social picture books that look at CSA? You've developed them specifically for CSA?
No. We have not developed for CSA, but it's just my idea.
Okay.
Probably, I guess these are the ways that we can try and elicit something from them. Okay, because many people think they can't do that also. They think that they just have no emotions. They don't understand what is happening in the environment. But this way of visual communication, as we call them, are actually a very good way of eliciting what they feel inside. So you'll realize that actually these children understand emotions. It's just that they don't know. So it can be developed, is what I'm just trying to, think that maybe this is one channel just to elicit from them.
Yeah, that sounds like a fantastic idea, and something that maybe we could think of developing as a standard set.
I see that Kadambari is actually adding to what Jayashree has said, that there are some behavioral indicators. and then you elicit response using pictures. Now, the whole idea here is how do you refine this methodology for the specific purpose of the discussion that we are having today, which is CSA documentation. So there are two issues. One is you know that CSA has occurred. It is already established. And then you need to do documentation for purposes of a medical legal. The other is you don't know it has taken place. Child has come to you only for a communication, an index of suspicion based on what Kadambari refers to as behavioral indicators. And you want to really elicit more. And we are, of course, familiar with the picture exchange communication system, but how do we refine this and adapt this to? So I have put the details of the website, on the chat. And if you go to the section on interventions and click on, let's say, the 8 to 12 or the 0 to 6, and you look at some of the CSA sections that we have, both for preventive work as well as medical legal issues when a case is established. It'll give you some ideas of what you can use, what you can adapt, so that in AISH itself, this becomes an established expertise based on the wonderful and professional work that you guys already do. So this gives us, some sense of let me tell you a couple of small things of what actually plays out in court. So I'm really jumping a step, and then I will request Sheila to spend about 5 minutes in sharing with you our experience of having worked in the Muzaffarpur child institution case. And, this refers to the whole point that Dr. Gopi Shankar also made about children in institutions. Just to remind you, see, one child who's abused once by one perpetrator means one thing. 47 girls abused multiple times by multiple perpetrators over 2 to 3 years, some perpetrators known, some not known. Which incident are you inquiring into that? And this is what happened in Muzaffarpur. In addition to bright children among these 47, there were those who had serious psychiatric problems, and there were those who had hearing and speech problems. And how did we go about actually doing the documentation? Because it was a Supreme Court order to us. The case was taken away from Bihar police and handed over to CBI. And the Supreme Court instructed us to assist the CBI, the investigative officer, in conducting and adding to Section 161. And the 154 page that we documented actually was added to part of the FIR, and the case was conducted in Delhi in the special court in Saket. Both Sheila and I were expert witnesses, 3 days of direct and cross-examination, and the kind of questions that were asked. So I'll request Sheila to speak for 5 minutes on that part. But I just want to tell you one thing about the many times I've had to go to court in a case of CSA, that see, the technique of how you communicate with children who have communication problems on trauma or on emotional issues, and how you document is one part. But when you go to court, it's a completely different ballgame. A couple of years ago, there were 6 girls who escaped from the girls' home right next to Nimhans here. The superintendent was implicated because there was a possibility of a trafficking issue, that 2 of those girls had hearing and speech deficit, and they were sent to us for evaluation, and we'd asked for a sign language expert because they were completely, they had no speech at all, no communicative speech at all, to basically assist us in this process. And then the case went to court. And we go all prepared and so on. But the kind of question that the defense put, and this is what Aish needs to be prepared for. Nothing about my expert testimony or what they asked is, Doctor, sign language expert to new kardidira ನಿಮ್ಮ assistants ke. Expert ಹೆಸರು ಹೇಳ್ತೀರಾ? And I had seen these people a year ago before the case came to trial. For the world of me, I didn't remember the name. Dr. A, you said you have formally requested for the assistance of a sign language expert. Can you show me in the file where your letter of request is present? Documentation, therefore, my friends, is exceedingly important. Which date did you do the assessment, or dates? Who did the assessment? How did you start the process of assessment? What was asked? What was the child's response? And even when you use pictures, so in another case, when I went to court, this was a very young child, and the child's evidence was as I had recorded. The child said that he lifted my frock, he pulled on my chaddi, and then he opened his trousers, and then a snake bit me. Now, in documentation, you have to follow it up by a question to say, bit you where? And that's where pictures or dolls come, and it is duly recorded. But you'll also have to follow it to say, where was the snake coming from? And again, the child has to demonstrate that it was, presumably between these guys' legs, that, because, and this child was only 3 years old or 2.5, but a very bright child. And for her, the penis, it was darkish, it was black, and that was the only name that she had for. So documentation becomes exceedingly important when you go to court, so that the precision and specificity in terms of dates, who did the assessment, is there a signature on every page, the exact nature of questions that were asked, the extent to which the questions were not leading, the description of what the child said, what the child pointed to, what the child demonstrated in verbatim. So these are not your words, that this is what the child demonstrated. The child took this doll, the child put the doll in front of this and on top, and then the child showed this motion. All this needs to be accurately put down as the child has demonstrated. So this is not your interpretation, or so it's what the exactly as the child has demonstrated or pointed out or said. Sheila?
Yeah, so I'm just putting on for you on the chat, and perhaps you could download the manual. Saves us from trying to get everyone's email. The Child as a Witness is a manual we developed for training the judiciary, the judicial personnel. But there are many things that I feel you could take a look at and tell us what you think. Because the way we go about evidence, whether it is with a neurotypical child or a child with disability, is the first thing is to assess the developmental ability. So we do a developmental assessment, because without developmental assessment, we cannot say whether the child even has the capacity to provide evidence. So in your case, because you see children with multiple disabilities, I mean, it's a given that they have a disability, or a lot of them do, except for this category you mentioned from residential schools. But I'll come to that in a minute. So the developmental assessment is to look in the 5 domains of development. We do it quite in a structured manner. We look at physical, speech and language, social, emotional, and cognitive. What is key here from an evidence perspective is the speech and language and cognitive development. Because you mentioned, for instance, that you see children with intellectual disability. Now, what we have seen through our experience, and is that children with mild intellectual disability are able to provide evidence, even in court. Let's take to begin with children who have speech, okay, but with mild intellectual disability. Now, these children may be of two categories, broadly speaking. Some of them may be exceedingly shy and inhibited, you know, and they still have a sense of, you know, shame or taboo in talking about private parts and so on. They're able to sort of understand that. Others, interestingly, are less inhibited and sometimes more open even in being able to communicate about some of these, you know, sexual abuse issues, because perhaps because their social skills are lower, and you know how social skills can vary even within a single category of mild intellectual disability children. So they speak more freely. In either case, when these children have to give evidence in court, they need to be prepared. That's because there is still a cognitive and a memory issue. So we do a lot of work with neurotypical children as well, but mild intellectual disability children to provide cues for memory and to, you know, have them remember what happened, try to get them to sequence, because these are things that are critical to the court in terms of memory, detail, sequencing, because this is what the defense is looking for, unfortunately. So this is now children with mild intellectual disability who do not have speech, and others who do not have speech. They may have average intelligence but no speech. We have used pictures extensively. One way is if the picture of the perpetrator is available, then we have used that and got children to describe actions. We have used art, and the way we document that is to say that, you know, I will try and find you some of our reports, maybe to send on to show you how we document it. We say the child was shown a picture, probably similar to what you do, and the child's response was this. So all the non-verbal responses were are recorded. The child's drawings are photographed and placed in the file, you know, so that there is a record and the court can actually see what the child drew. So those are some of the ways that we have worked. The other issue is on developmental assessments itself. We have used standardized testing, you know, psychological testing to establish where the child is at. Children who have moderate and, you know, downward from their intellectual disability, we do not recommend that they give evidence in court. You cannot use the child in those instances, even if they have speech, because the court, their evidence unfortunately would not stand in court because they have serious cognitive and memory impairments, and they're really unable to give enough evidence or give it in a way that would assist the court to come to any decision. So in cases like that, we are reliant on hearsay, on what the parents and caregivers tell us about the child. And this is where we look at emotional, behavioral, and mental health issues. So one part is the developmental issue, and the other part is the mental health issues. And each of these is a piece of evidence. So we record very carefully the kind of emotional and behavioral changes that parents or caregivers may report. So to form some part of the evidence to say this is what has been happening in recent times. Now, emotional and behavioral issues cannot be used as standalones, and the court cannot use them as the sole evidence, you know, to say that, well, if the child is behaving like this, it must be so. But it is really more used as corroborative evidence. If that can be added on to what the child is able to draw or indicate through sign language, emotional and behavioral problems or changes that have occurred serve to strengthen the evidence, because as you are probably aware, there is a whole body of literature on childhood trauma and, you know, the impact of child sexual abuse on children. So these are some basic assessments we do from a point of view of recommending to the court whether the child has the capacity to provide testimony or not. And we state these in reports, and we state why they do or why they have not. And the second thing is how the mental health behavioral part can be used as corroborative evidence along with other things. So these are some of the ways in which we have approached it. That is in a nutshell. We feel, I just wanted to tell you perhaps some of our plans, given that, you know, even eliciting evidence from neurotypical children is not easy, and the court really struggles with it. We are very keen on developing methodologies for children with developmental disabilities, with communication problems, with mild intellectual disability, autism, as you have mentioned. So we want to look at this whole gamut to see how best, you know, we can develop a strong methodology to elicit evidence from children, you know, using pictures, using dolls, etc. And part of our work is going to be to develop picture cards and stories, exactly what you said, Dr. Jayashree, to you know, use with children like you deal with, and see how we can strengthen methodology. Because while Ayesh's question is about documentation, we feel very strongly that the emphasis, you know, not the emphasis, but the basis of any sound documentation is sound and solid scientific methodology. Where the methodology is not really there, or it's very broad, then the documentation not only becomes a little difficult, but it just does not hold water in court. So one of the ideas actually we had, and I'm so happy that we're on a meeting today so we can actually maybe discuss this, is we were keen to work with Ayesh to develop this training, to develop these methodologies first of all, and then to develop a training module that will incorporate these methodologies, so that together with you, you know, with your team, we can take these methodologies across the country and train departments of psychiatry and, you know, other services for developmental disability in how to elicit information, how to document, and how to deal with judicial processes. So one is training and methodologies for childcare professionals like us, basically. The other is, once that is done, to have a simpler and a more dilute version of that, shall we say, for judicial personnel, just like the manual that we have developed, so that they are oriented to children with disability, and that they see that they cannot get what they call a statement, so that they have an understanding of different developmental disabilities, at least a broad sense, and they're able to tailor their expectations you know, to a child with autism, a child with mild intellectual disability, because it is only if the special court judges and the court personnel understand the kind of children that we work with and their limitations, that is these kids, will they even be willing to make special provisions. So, you know, training for the court will have a lot of suggestions that we give for younger children. You will find that in the manual I've uploaded for you. But I think there will need to be many more for children with developmental disabilities, such as, you know, giving them frequent breaks, you know, allowing the use of dolls and pictures. You'd be surprised how different the methodologies of each judge are. Some judges say, yes, we will allow it, and others say, absolutely not. In the Muzaffarpur instance, which Dr. Shekhar was mentioning to you, we had a child with mild intellectual disability, a 14-year-old, 15-year-old child, and the judge refused to allow the use of a doll for her to be able to, she had the ability of speech, but because of her intellectual disability and then the emotional issues that went with it, she found it exceedingly difficult to articulate it and say in so many words where she had been touched and what had been done to her. So it was very challenging because the judge said, put the doll away and tell her to speak, make her speak. So, when judges are not oriented to the capacities and the skills that children with developmental disabilities have or don't have, then, they tend to go with standard procedure. And really, it is not, I don't think we should understand this as them being insensitive and so on. You look at it from a systemic point of view. From their perspective, they could be in a lot of trouble if they sort of were outside what they call outside the law or doing anything that the law does not provide for. So the step one would be ourselves and methodologies and trying out these methodologies first so that we have them really solid. So we need to pilot them, practice them, plug our gaps, and then take it to the, Kadambari madam says, sensitizing the judiciary and the police, right, on children with communication disorders and developmental disabilities. And then I feel that alongside that, there would need to be a serious advocacy the law to take these procedural changes and say, yes, we allow procedural change for children with disability. There is no other, there are no shortcuts to these things. And I really feel that we should do the work, and we'd be happy to assist, but we would really need your support because your expertise in communication disorders is non-paralleled. We have a Department of Child Psychiatry, of course, at NIMHANS, but we do not do, and we see a great many children with developmental disabilities, and recommendations are made, inputs are given, etc. But you deal exclusively with these children and you deal with them day in and day out. So, I think it would be very useful if we worked with you and then we piloted the methodologies with you. You piloted them with your children and then we look at what works, what doesn't. I think it would be path-breaking work in this country. Because disability is always such an invisible agenda. Children are already not so visible, and children with disability are, nothing is ever tailored or geared to them. So these are some thoughts I wanted to share, that we have a base which we have shared with you, which you could look at. So one way to move forward is to look at the manual that we have developed. And if you could make some notes and tell us which parts could be taken up for further work and, adapted to children with developmental disability and communication issues, we could take it forward from there. We are happy to develop the methodologies based on your suggestions. We are happy to do the work for you and feed it back to you to try out. And then, we go through several rounds of iteration and see how we can really solidify the methodology.
As we come to the last part of this session with these very comprehensive and inspiring stuff that Sheila has shared, I'm happy to tell you that we've just crossed the number of 100 on this meeting today. And I think that's a testament of how important this issue is. As we have been speaking and discussing, I have taken the liberty to put on chat a summary of the importance of developmental assessment, cues for memory, sequencing, details, use of pictures, actions and art, documentation process, how to record nonverbal responses, how you place drawings in the file, the importance of caregiver and medical evidence, mental health impact and trauma, emotional and behavioral changes and indicators, corroborative evidence, how do you assess a child's capacity for abuse narrative, what methodologies can we use for children with disability, methodology as the basis of documentation, and that with training in collaboration with Aish, piloting, practicing, refining, we really work on advocacy and procedural changes with the judiciary for special provisions like frequent breaks or the use of dolls and the use of paper pencil tasks. We've also put on the chat the clinical practice guidelines that Sheila and I have written, and also a PDF document we wrote about the child as a witness under POCSO, plus the larger website in which many other material is also present. There are other questions that have come. Praveen, for example, has asked about individuals with auditory neuropathy spectrum and psychogenic hearing loss. At some point of time, Praveen, we will look at this in the context of, let's say, CSA and medical legal issues. That really is the focus of today's discussion. I'm happy we had this meeting. I'm also happy that, you know, there are almost 100 of us on this meeting. And it's very encouraging that, you know, Jayashree speaks about the criticality of cognitive assessment, and both Jayashree and Kadambari have spoken about how this would be a great initiative and a dire need with the judiciary, and the fact that, you know, we could team up in a manner that would really benefit the whole community of communication disorders experts. And we have already actually put out a letter to the director of AISH on this issue. We've been some communication with Dr. Venkatesan as well. And as Yashodhara points out, that it would be really important to educate caregivers in addition to judiciary and so on. So in the last 15 minutes that we have before we close the session, and this was just the beginning, friends, we would be absolutely happy, and as Sheila pointed out, based on your suggestions, we can develop the methodology and send it back to you. You practice it, give us feedback, we refine it. So let's spend the last 15 minutes in feedback and questions from you, starting with Goswami. Please go ahead, Goswami. Do ask your question.
Sir, good morning, sir. Thank you for your wonderful lecture, sir. I just have one or two queries and comments, sir.
Please.
One is basically what happens when we get these kids or patients, the timeline, like we will be getting after 6 months, 9 months. After that, they will say you take an opinion from All India Institute of Speech and Hearing.
Right.
So what happened, that critical time is lost. Neither the patient will remember nor the kid will remember what happened to them. So I was just thinking that in case, if it is a possible that if we plan that there should be a timeline, that within this time frame, if we obtain the information, the authenticity of that information will be more robust. That is one thing which almost all of us find.
Let me quickly respond to this, and then you can ask your second question. I'm sure Sheila has some response. Goswamiji, see, there are two responses I have. Of course, you're right. Whether it's medical evidence or whether it's psychological evidence, the sooner you do it, the better. You know, if you do not document a cut immediately, you know, a month later it would have healed, so the evidence is not there. On the other hand, if I were to ask each of you, how far back into your childhood memories do you remember things that happened to you? You'd be surprised that children do remember, even if they have communication problems, but they do not have intellectual disability. Of course, as Sheila pointed out, if the intellectual disability is moderate, severe, or profound, it's going to be very difficult. So that's a framework we need to keep in mind, which is why what Sheila mentioned as memory cues or scaffolding, you know, how do you use certain events that have taken place to, you know, have a reference date, and then see whether you can work around an interaction with the child to see that. So this is called the technique of scaffolding. So going ahead, you know, we will share some of these issues with you. You had another question, Goswami?
Yes, sir. Because why I asked was, sir, because most of the kids are, say, for example, like when we see these adults, persons with dementia or degenerative diseases, they will forget that what happened in that, what we call as what you were trying to say, it is a verbatim. Because when they go in the court of law, the, what you call as a defense lawyer will always look for certain loopholes that it is not matching. So even if one sentence or one incidence goes off, the case totally goes for a toss. That was one thing which maybe I may be wrong, but this is what most of our patients say, that, okay, like say for example, he might not be able to remember the day, or he may not be able to remember the date or place, whatever it may be. Sometimes, and especially when the kids have got intellectual or cognitive declines, definitely there is a possibility with that. So my
Yeah.
only suggestion was that,
Yeah.
is it possible that whenever we have kids, or whenever we look into that they have issues, if we can get as a standard procedure that they should be evaluated for their speech language skills, irrespective of whether they have disability or they don't have, so that we know, okay, that their communication skills were quite apt, so whatever they are conveying, it holds good in the court of law.
Right. I have just one thing to say in response to that. You see, if documentation is restricted to on 3rd of September at 10:20 in the morning, what happened? As opposed to, see, because child sexual abuse, particularly when an abuser actually manipulates, the whole process of grooming, there's a lot of stuff that has happened before that incident at 10:20 on 3rd of September. How he got the child, gave the child gifts, told the child that your father and mother are horrible people. And, all that is corroborative evidence, because, you're creating a circumstance of, because that in terms of evidence raises the culpability, which is the intention to set up circumstances in which then the final act of abuse takes place. So there are various ways in which the issue that you have raised can be addressed. Of course, our work, ladies and gentlemen, is only with children. So I don't want to bring in the dementia and the old age problem here, that we are a child issue. We work with child-related issues. And as many of you have pointed out, our national initiative is one on child protection. And I believe that advocacy for legal processes for children with disability, particularly communication disorders who've been abused, is a critical child protection issue. And therefore, for Aish to embrace the idea of child protection as a mandate, not just communication disorders, the child protection is a wonderful initiative, because you're really expanding the scope of, and I see this as an absolutely critical meeting that we've had today. Sheila, any responses before we take some other questions? And we'll come to Hema after that, and Jayashree as well. Yes.
No, we can go ahead with some of the questions, but
Sure.
before we end, if I may request, since I see on the chat that a lot of people have put that this would be wonderful, it would be a great partnership and a very useful initiative. If we could, Dr. Shekhar, have a brief discussion before we close on how we take it forward, who would be our contact point and who we can work with. And so we just have some operational details. Otherwise, discussions like these are wonderful. And then, so for us to really actively take it forward, that was my only request. But you can go ahead with the questions until. I think Dr. Jayashree wants to say something.
And
Hema madam wants to say, has a question.
Yeah, Jayashree Shanbal. Okay, Hema, you go first.
Sir, good morning, sir. Actually, I have a question. Like you, as Goswami sir pointed out, some evidence would have lost, or some duration would have passed by the time the child comes with an abusive complaint. But I saw a case with mild intellectual disability case, a female who was around 15 to 16 years old. The evidence was she had conceived. So that was the stage. And the parents have got her for the evaluation, where the FIR has been placed for that particular case. And the girl, whatever I call female girl, she is saying her thing, like her mind has been disturbed, and then she is saying willingly there was some abuse and she cooperated for that particular abuse. And she was so much totally disturbed, she could not answer anything for whatever question I had asked. And all of these things were not to the notice of the parents, because both the parents were daily wage workers. So in in such cases, how to go about and how to profile this particular case, for the police inquiry or the judicial inquiry. That we are really not aware. This case was just 2 months back, and they are from some tribal community, and the house is segregated, or they live in a colony, but parents are not there to monitor this particular girl. And
This is a 15-year-old with intellectual disability.
Yes. Intellectual disability, and she has conceived also, and we need to give a report to the guy, like from Ayush. They asked for an intellectual disability report, and they also have other gynecological issues also.
Yeah, no. So that's established. I mean, if a 15-year-old is pregnant, there's no other way it can have happened except. I'm saying, was the perpetrator an adult?
Yes.
Sir, he was also an around like 17, 18-year-old. I just probed, like I just took extra information. So this was the thing.
He was adult, sir.
He was
an adult.
17, 18 or something.
No, more than that. He was a worker.
No, right. So, again, there are, in terms of the robustness of the case for court, because there is pregnancy and you can always do a DNA, you have hard medical evidence here, you don't really need any other evidence to prove the case in a court of law. So the issue here more is the psychological impact on the girl, and how do you assist this, and what is her understanding of in her life, and how do you assist her? And I see that a lot of people, for example, Yashoda and Santosh have put in stuff like working. Supposing it's close family members are involved, and how do you work with parents and parents' awareness? And so these are all related issues. We may not be able to, Yashil, I'm coming to you. We may not be able to really go into substantive responses, but I can see that, there is a deep interest in Aish on these issues. And today's meeting was really to kind of open this discussion. And if someone can put on chat who our point of contact will be to take this forward, we would have specific identified individuals to carry the work that, Sheila, anything from you?
Yeah, I just wanted to say in response to Dr. Yashoda's chat message about the ethical issues involved. There is the issue of mandatory reporting, as you are aware of in POCSO.
Right.
But these are some things we really need to discuss on how we position ourselves and what ethics means. Does ethical approach mean protecting the family or protecting the child? These are some things that, as Dr. Shekhar says, we need to really have a depth discussion on. The other question that Mansi ma'am has put on private chat, Mansi, if you don't mind, I'll share it because I think it's important. About a 15-year-old girl with moderate intellectual disability developing speech utterances indicating sexual behaviors. She says this could be because she overheard sexual activity or was going through something herself. How do we bring this issue to light without overstepping? Again, Mansi ma'am, there's no question of overstepping. In fact, if we have the opportunity, we must inquire. If you don't ask or you don't inquire, as in your case, you will never know. And if we do not ask and we do not know, it is important to bear in mind that the child may continue to be abused. So there is no question of overstepping any boundaries. In fact, we are bound by the law to inquire and to actually find out where there is CSE and to report it. And as childcare service providers in Aish, NIMHANS, places of health, and as we are health service providers, we are even more duty bound to do these things. I actually wonder, because I see some of these questions, just another idea which can be discussed and you can think about and get back to us. I wonder whether it would be useful to this group if Dr. Shekhar and myself did a training program on child sexual abuse, you know, not in a disability context, but first to understand it even in neurotypical children. And we took disability discussions as we went along.
Wonderful.
You know,
That'd be wonderful.
maybe
Let's plan
that
it.
then we could think, we could apply every concept of child sexual abuse, from dynamics to interviewing to assessments to so on, and see how we would apply it and understand the same with children with disability. That's one way we could actually make a start, and then we would probably find the gaps in methodology where children with disability are concerned, and then move forward on the other project that I shared with you that I thought we could do together.
So my suggestion, Sheila, is that Sangeeta Mahesh, who was in contact with us, and Jayashree Shanbal have together initiated this, and they would be our points of contact.
Great.
And I see that, there are many other issues and questions. Malika Lewis, for example, also wanted to ask Malika, let's organize this session ASAP. In addition to working on some modalities by which we go ahead with the specific protocols and processes for communication disorders, CSA documentation, reporting in court, and so on, as a collaborative kind of thing. And we will be in touch, both with Sangeeta Mahesh and Jayashree Shanbal, to work on the next program, which will be a session just on CSA to look at processes and so on. We'll be happy to do that for you. We will work out a convenient date in conjunction with Sangeeta and Jayashree. And we will see you soon on that and take it forward from there.
I see one last question before we close. I'll just respond to that maybe. Malvi ma'am says, what if the child's mind has subconsciously suppressed the bad memory? How do we go about the interview then? These are some things we'd like to discuss with you in the workshop. In fact, when we sort of talk about it, you are right, because one of the ways in which anxiety plays out is through dissociation, which one of your colleagues highlighted early in this session. Dissociation takes many forms, and one of them is to suppress the memory. And what we see externally is the child says nothing happened, because the child has suppressed the memory because the memory is too painful. So maybe we can discuss when we do our session how we can use a lot of methods from reassurance and communication skills that help the child understand who you are, what you will do, and so on the one hand. On the other, how we can use art and methods like art and pictures to help the child retrieve some of these difficult methods, along with treatment of anxiety, which basically means what are methods we can use when the child is, when we facilitate the child to retrieve these memories through art and pictures. How do we use relaxation exercises like deep breathing and, guided imagery and so on, to help the child also to relax and, contain the anxiety that is likely to resurface, at a time like that. So I think these are all very good questions, and we can keep them in mind when we do this workshop, which would open up many more questions for us, certainly from your perspective, and help us to understand better the children you work with.
So just a final thought, do put in your feedback on today's session. And also, Jayashree, we've already written to your director. I also wanted to tell you, we are mandated by the Ministry of Women and Child Development to provide this kind of assistance. So whatever training, whatever resource we do for Aish, there is no resource fee, there is no training fee. It's part of our mandate, and we are happy to do it. So there'll be no financial liability on Aish at all. I just wanted to say, from the National Initiative and Integrated Resource on Child Protection, Mental Health and Psychosocial Care from NIMHANS Bangalore, and the team here, wishing all of you the best of health. Be safe and be in good cheer, and we will meet soon, my friends. We'll meet soon. Take care of yourselves. Jai Hind, Jai Karnataka.